so ago that we do record these Safeguarding Adults Board development sessions, and we put them on our website so that they're available for people to watch in the future. These development sessions, I'm conscious there's a few people from our newly established trainers group that have joined us today. These are for board members and subcommittee members to assist them in their strategic role around safeguarding. This is the 6th in the series of development sessions that we've done, and today's focusing on self-neglect. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Claire Nixon and I'm the Safeguarding Adults Board Coordinator, and sat next to me, Vida Morris, who's the independent chair of the Safeguarding Adults Board. So, starting off with defining self-neglect. So before the Care Act, self-neglect wasn't a form of abuse covered by Safeguarding Adults procedures. So the Care and Support statutory guidance that accompanied the Care Act made it a specific category of abuse. And within that statutory guidance, we've got a definition that it includes a lack of self-care, so neglecting personal hygiene, nutrition, hydration, or health, lack of care of one's environment, so that might result in unpleasant or dirty home conditions, or an increased level of risk in the domestic environment, such as health and safety and fire risks associated with hoarding. And then finally, refusal of services that could alleviate these issues. So that might include a refusal of care services, treatment, assessments or intervention, which could potentially improve, I guess, that either lack of self-care or lack of care. It goes on to say there should be a broad view of what constitutes self-neglect, and it shouldn't be constrained to just hoarding. I think as we've gone through the years, I think certainly initially after the Care Act, people, I think, thought self-neglect is hoarding. It's much more than that. And it does have links to other types of abuse. So for us in Newcastle, potentially linked to neglect, domestic abuse, financial abuse, and we're going to come on to that in a little bit. I think it's also really important to highlight, in terms of language, the term self-neglect can be stigmatising, and we should be really careful about how and when it is used, because the term self, I suppose, is placing a lot of blame on the person themselves. So it's understanding, I suppose, the why that person might be self-neglecting it, and is it a choice or are there other factors at play? We've had some SAR referrals recently where the circumstances have sort of been a bit of a grey area between self-neglect and neglect, or potentially a combination of both. So I think just really important to highlight the difference between those two forms of abuse, but also highlighting, I suppose, if we are concerned about self-neglect, but there is someone who's providing care, whether that's paid or unpaid, that we need to fully explore that person's role or organisation's role. And we know learning around identification and support for informal carers comes through in our Safeguarding Adult reviews and audits. And it's particularly crucial in the area of self-neglect. So we really need to have a clear understanding of the level of support a carer is providing and how often, making sure they're identified on professional records as a person's informal carer, consideration of their needs, any contingency arrangements in case there's a breakdown in their carer support. Local authorities have got a duty to offer and undertake carers assessments for informal carers. And just to highlight, whilst the local authority role around carers assessment, it's all agencies play a role in identifying informal carers and signposting them, supporting them to support available. Local picture, so 19% of all our Section 42 inquiries last year were about self-neglect, which is the second most common form of abuse we have in Newcastle. Slightly more inquiries about male adults at risk, which is actually slightly different to the overall picture in terms of inquiries. We have slightly more females overall. Most common primary support reason was physical support, 35% of all Section 42 inquiries about neglect. In terms of who's reporting concerns about self-neglect, it's Newcastle Hospitals Trust who are the most common referrer, followed by police and housing providers. And as I mentioned, in terms of neglect, self-neglect does sometimes co-occur with concerns about neglect, emotional and financial abuse. The link between poverty and self-neglect, that's something that we explored as a Safeguarding Adults Board during the pandemic. And as I say, in terms of that, thinking about stigmatising and causes of self-neglect, we need to be really thinking about, is the self-neglect actually as a result of a person's financial situation, financial difficulty? And the impact of not having enough money to pay for food, bills, accommodation, transport, fuel, etc., digital access might present in a very similar way to self-neglect. But if we address that person's financial situation, that then might reduce the risk around self-neglect. And just to shout out about the Safeguarding Newcastle Against Poverty project, the SNAP project, if you've not heard about it, that's an initiative between the council and partners to address the links between poverty and safeguarding risks, presence within food banks, community pantries, other community locations, to try and prevent financial crisis and potentially reduce the risk of abuse or neglect, and includes training for staff and volunteers. We have a self-neglect policy in Newcastle, and we've had one for some time, but it was reviewed and relaunched this time last year. This review was recommended in a number of SARs across the north of Tyne. It is a joint policy across Northumberland, North Tyneside and Newcastle, and in particular in our adult L SAR. Those reviews highlighted that there was nothing wrong with the content of the policy, that didn't need updating, but what was the issue was people weren't aware of it and therefore weren't using it. So I think it's just an important point for us to think about, is how do we raise awareness and make sure people are aware of it and using it. In terms of what that policy says, what's included within that, it builds on a lot of resources that we have in place. So our 7-minute briefings and also our public animation that we've got around self-neglect, both of those resources developed on a regional basis. So the policy encourages early intervention and action prior to safeguarding. It includes learning from safeguarding adult reviews to inform practice. It's got an expanded section on the Mental Capacity Act, including where a person refuses an assessment and thinking about things like executive functioning. We've got a new section around working with people who self-neglect and a focus on person-centred approaches. A section on different agency roles in terms of what they should be doing in terms of identifying and responding to self-neglect. We updated the clutter image rating tool and hoarding assessment, and we added a couple of new appendices that we didn't have in the previous version. So one on nutrition and self-neglect and one on poverty and self-neglect. As I say, that was primarily as a result of the learning that we had during COVID. Just a quick mention for the 7-minute briefings, there are 7 of them. So one's an overview of self-neglect. There's one on alcohol and substance misuse. There's one on engagement, one on hoarding, one on homelessness, one on self-care and trauma. The hoarding assessment and clutter tool that's in the appendices, this I think is used quite widely across the country, can be used by any practitioner from any agency where there's a concern about hoarding, as well as the image tools. So I suppose a standardised way of identifying what the level of hoarding is, taking away that professional judgment. It also asks practitioners to think about risk identification. So what are you concerned about in the property? Blocked exit, structural damage, rodents, things like that. And I think primarily the tools to be used to evidence, to add additional evidence to onward referrals. So whether that's referrals into safeguarding, referrals into the fire service, contact with housing, RSPCA or environmental health. Self-neglect can be really complex to risk manage. We've got that real balancing act of balancing a person's right to choose or refuse services and a duty of care and desire to improve a person's health and well-being. And as sort of previously mentioned in terms of the policy content, safeguarding adults procedures shouldn't be the first response to concerns. We need to make sure we're taking proportionate responses and considering the person's ability to protect themselves from harm. We need to be clear with the adult at risk, their family where appropriate, and other services about what we're concerned about and how we can help sharing that risk management with the person and services. And Mental Capacity Act is a key consideration. Does the person have mental capacity to make decisions relevant to self-neglect? So, on to mental capacity. As per the first principle of the Mental Capacity Act, a person must be presumed to have capacity to make their own decisions. However, and this is a big however, a prior presumption of mental capacity may be revisited in self-neglect cases, and this is confirmed by the Code of Practice, which states that one of the reasons why people may question a person's capacity to make a specific decision is the person's behaviour or circumstances cause doubt as to whether they have capacity to make that decision. Best practice is highlighted where agencies have taken a relationship-centred approach, and shortfalls are evident where there's an oversimplification of the principles of the MCA or a failure to assess, including lack of consideration of executive functioning, which is where I suppose a person might say they will do one thing but don't actually follow that through, and that might lead you to question a person's Mental Capacity Act. Touched on, I suppose, a difficulty if somebody doesn't engage with a capacity assessment. And I think there is quite a lot of information on the 39 Essex Chambers resources around this. We need to be evidencing how we've made efforts to persuade the person to take part, to liaise with other professionals about what alternative strategies might help. Thinking about why the person doesn't want to engage in the assessment, giving them some element of choice around who will carry it out, and thinking about, I suppose, that link between self-neglect and neglect. Is somebody's non-engagement as a result of actions of others, where we might be then considering things like inherent jurisdiction. So ultimately, if we've not been able to get the person to engage in a capacity assessment, and we can't force somebody to engage in that, we then need to have to think about, do we have enough evidence to come to a reasonable belief that the person lacks capacity, if steps are going to be taken on that basis, and if the stakes are particularly high, we might have to go to the Court of Protection around that particular decision and ask them to make the decision. And that last point on the slide there, just because somebody has mental capacity, that doesn't negate the need for action under safeguarding adults procedures, particularly where the risk of harm is deemed to be serious or critical. So there are a lot of safeguarding adult reviews about self-neglect. It is the most common form of abuse looked at nationally by safeguarding adult reviews. I'm just going to pick out a few of the things on there. Face-to-face contact, really important, and I think something that's potentially we've lost or reduced since COVID. So seeing the person, seeing the situation that they're in. Making sure we've got effective escalation, particularly if we've got a serious concern and the risk management plan isn't resolving any of that risk. Where are we escalating that to? Taking trauma-informed approaches. We've talked about this quite a lot, but a clean-up might seem the obvious action to take in terms of addressing, say, a person's home environment, but actually that can be particularly traumatizing for the person and might not result in long-term positive outcomes for them. Quite a number of safeguarding adult reviews include learning around fire risks and liaison and referral with the fire service, particularly where there's hoarding. So a lot of flammable material, and if we've got some of the other risk indicators like somebody who's smoking, somebody who's got mobility difficulties, might be using emollients. So thinking about all of those things in the self-neglect situation. We've done a recent audit, multi-agency audit around health needs and self-neglect, which is getting reported to the board today. Some of the areas for improvement identified within that audit: improve identification and support for informal carers, including routine use of carer risk tools and assessments. Strengthen documentation and review of mental capacity assessments, especially in complex or fluctuating presentations of health. Ensure proactive information sharing between agencies of concerns received where there are known health needs, particularly with health safeguarding leads and the person's GP. And engagement in local safeguarding processes with private or non-commissioned care providers and services who might be providing care and support to somebody but are not known to statutory services, and they might be concerned about self-neglect. System-wide factors. This is sort of regularly quoted in research around self-neglect. So almost got a bit of a perfect storm, where we've got a combination of people who are potentially terrified of losing their independence or worried about state intervention. And then on the flip side of that, we've got sort of systems and processes that are set up currently around time-limited involvement, eligibility for support, charging policies, and remote and hybrid working. And that then, I guess, means these people are often quite hidden. And, you know, okay, yeah, that's fine. You don't want our help, we'll go away. So it's about linking that to that tenacity, professional curiosity going back. So, just summing up, and we do sum up these development sessions with some questions to consider. So, are you confident that there's an awareness and understanding of the self-neglect policy within your organisation? We know that working with people who self-neglect can be quite lonely. Staff say they feel helpless, it's frustrating, can feel quite exposed. So how are we supporting staff involved in supporting people who self-neglect? Are there opportunities for staff to work flexibly over longer periods of time to facilitate working at a person's own pace? Are there places and spaces where concerns and decision making about self-neglect can be discussed, and that not just being limited to safeguarding adults procedures and multi-agency meetings in that forum? And then thinking, how legally literate are you and colleagues in relation to responding to self-neglect? So yes, that's gone actually quite quicker than I thought, but it gives us an opportunity, I guess, for sort of 5-10 minutes of any discussions or questions. I have linked on the slides, which will be circulated, the policy, the 7-minute briefings, the self-neglect animation, the thematic workshop or training that we do have on offer, or we did have on offer. We need to sort of get that up and running again. A self-neglect thematic review we did in Newcastle 3 years ago, and then some more recent thematic reviews that have been published in the North East, so one in Cumbria and one in Northumberland. So thank you very much, everybody. I will stop recording and then I will open it up and see if there are any questions or comments, if I can find the button. There we go, stop recording. Okay, I'll go back to the question.